Hello and welcome to What Would Jesus Tech? My name is Andrew Noble. I am glad to be with you today with my co-host Joel and Jay, who we'll get to in a moment. If you're new to our podcast, we are hoping to equip Christians to use tech to find rest and to glorify God. We know some of you listening, you're building tech, you're in the weeds. You might be from Silicon Valley, which is where Jay is from, actually. And some of you, you're just parents who are trying to figure it out for your kids. Some of you are pastors trying to figure it out for your church. And so we hope to help you today by talking about Jay's book. The day that this episode releases is actually the same day as the release of the book. It just so happened to line up that way. Listen, Speak is the title of the book, and we'll get into that. Jay is the lead pastor at Westgate Church in the Silicon Valley of California. He's written a couple other books as well. Jay, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, man, thank you guys for having me. Yeah, I'm excited about wherever this conversation is going to go.
Yes, which is fun with these kind of, you read the book and then you're like, oh, I want to double tap on that, and then you get to do it in the podcast. It's an excuse. I mean, we've wanted to have you on the podcast before, and really, we're not a huge podcast. We're not rolling in money with advertisements, but it's great to have you on. I'm curious just to kind of give listeners a bit of the history of you a little bit. So you weren't born in the USA. You come early in life. Eventually you get into youth ministry, you start pastoring, and then you're in Silicon Valley and you write a book on analog church. So that's the high level, but I don't know what pieces you want to get to tell me before writing that first book of yours. Like, what motivated you to start writing on tech and the Christian life?
Yeah, great question. I've been in Silicon Valley my whole life. I'm 44 now, so I was 4 when I moved here. So I guess that would have been, early mid 1980s. I remember, my mom and I immigrated here, single mom. So we lived with my aunt and my uncle at their house for a number of years. And my uncle worked at IBM at the time. And so we had several big sort of IBM personal computers around the house. I remember playing this really weird, like Winter Olympics game. It was like floppy disk type thing. So very early, as a kid, especially coming from the background I came from, it was magic. This box was like a magic box, I couldn't believe it. So I remember having just this I was enamored, I was enthralled. I was enchanted, in the words of Charles Taylor, truly it was enchantment. And so I think I had this fascination with it. And then, of course, Silicon Valley back then was not what it is now. So having watched the place I've called home basically my whole life sort of grow and evolve over the course of my teenage years and then into my adult years, and then pastoring just a lot of men and women who are making the stuff every day that's just pervasive in our lives, like these little black boxes I carry around in my back pocket. I was telling you guys before we hit record, like I'll be in this office later tonight with a bunch of dudes who every day they're like making this little black box, and it's so for me, it really started just from a pastoral perspective. I was trying to help the people I'm called to serve. And this is just their reality. They're asking all sorts of questions about the influence and impact of their work on the world and its formational impact on people. They live in a very strange sort of tension. And then when it really hit me was like my own digital addictions, honestly. And just a number of years ago, I found myself so digitally addicted. And I realized, this is the life I'm choosing to live, but it's at the same time not the life I want to live, So what is that? And I know there's a different sort of way to live and move and have my being in the world that really moves me much closer to God's glory and the good of all and human flourishing and all those things. So that's really where it came from. So I just started reading, not necessarily Christian books, but I just started a number of years ago, started studying. It's just the way my body and my brain work. So, that's when I was first introduced to people like Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman and then more contemporary writers, whoever they might be, Cal Newport or Sherry Turkle or Jerome
Mm-hmm.
Lanier, whoever. And I just started eating this stuff up. Like, it was like my mind was opening to a whole new world. It was like the curtain got pulled, in the Wizard of Oz. And so I haven't stopped. So that's kind of where it came from. People ask me that a lot. It's like, you live in Silicon Valley and then your first two books have the word analog in them. That doesn't seem right, And that's that. Yeah. So that's where it came from.
Well, and it's interesting as people position you that way. Literally, the Gospel Coalition positioned you as not anti-tech, but you were on one side of a debate with
Yeah.
another person, and you were supposed to be the guy who's like pushing an anti-tech. And I would say, like, I've read a lot of what you've written, and you might be more on the side of like an Andy Crouch, Jake Meter, cautious about technology as a
Yeah.
Christian.
Yeah.
And yet, like, I've heard things from you talk about, I don't know, the data analytics that you use at your church. Like, I worked
Yeah.
in sales at a tech company, so I know sales and marketing funnels. It sounds like you do that for your
Yeah.
church.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so you are pro tech. You have on your church's website right now, download an app to
Yeah.
connect with the church. Like, you seem to be very pro technology on a day-to-day basis.
Yes.
So it's like, how should we position you? Are you pro technology? Are you anti technology? Tech optimist?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
words do you use to succinctly summarize it?
Yeah. I guess the best way to describe it, it's one of the first things I wrote in Analog Church, which is my first book. It came out in 2020, but I wrote the words in 2018. So like 6 years ago,
Right.
I think I was pretty clear in that book. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not anti-technology. And then there's a
Mm-hmm.
line that's informed even the way we think about tech here. Not that we do it well or stay totally true to it. Sometimes we get misaligned and we got to course correct. But really, the mantra for us is digital informs and analog transforms. So the two can, and probably in many ways should, dance with each other. I am not anti-technology, throw it all away. I have friends who are, and they have actually quite compelling reasons for why they are. It's intriguing to me, and I'm open to that. Maybe that's where we go. But as it stands right now, I'm all for leveraging the tools to bring good and to maximize the potential for good. All I'm saying is we cannot allow the tools to mediate those things in life that have to be embodied. This is a silly example I use in one of my early books, but I could watch YouTube videos of CrossFit athletes all day long. I could intellectually tell you all the information about how to do CrossFit routines and exercises. I could do that. And my body could just continue to waste away as I eat
Right.
flaming hot Cheetos watching CrossFit videos. But knowing the information really matters. Like, I need those videos or
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. I need like the gym where I can watch the people do it. But then at some point to transform, I've got to go like with my body and put in the effort. But both are necessary. So I don't know what that means, but that's kind of how I think about the dance between the two.
Yeah, and I guess being a pastor in the valley, you are, talking to other pastors in the area. So I'm curious, from what you see, do you think churches in general and churches in NorCal are using tech enough? Like, should churches be using tech more than they do now, or less?
Mm. Honestly, it kind of depends on the church. My experience, it's limited, but I am, I think fairly well connected with Silicon Valley and Bay Area pastors at large. There's a real variance here, even in philosophy. Like, I've got pastor friends in the area, not many, but a handful, who are like, we're not doing the online thing at all. It was
Mm-hmm.
just for COVID. I'm actually all for that in many ways. The only reason we're continuing to have our services online is because the data and the metrics have showed us, and this is going to sound crazy, but we've had a lot of new people in our church in the last 3-4 years, kind of post-pandemic world, 2-3 years. And we have the data on this 100%, like literally 100% of them that we've asked, hey, what was your first engagement with this
Yeah.
church? 100% of the new people who've shown up through our doors physically embodied, 100% of them. And at this point, this is hundreds of people that we've asked. 100% watched our service online anywhere between 3 and 12 times before they came. So for us, I heard Ed Stetzer say these words. He said, the online is like the new lobby. And so that's why we're keeping online going. But we've got some friends who they shut it down, like you literally cannot watch anything from them at all. They have like a podcast where you can listen to a sermon, but that's it. And then we've got some friends who have just gone full board, like to the point where I would say, man, I don't think you're using the technology. I think maybe the technology is using you. They're becoming an online sort of content church sort of thing. So yeah, there's an interesting dance happening. The thing that's most encouraging to me at a local level, though, is that the conversation is ongoing. We talk about it a lot. It still comes up a lot. Hey, what is sort of a healthy ecclesiology for us in the cultural moment that we're in? So I think churches are still navigating it, but there's a high variance on what churches are doing here.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you. There's a struggle. I've felt it in terms of my own participation in my own ministry at churches, and I preach, and then I'm like, should I link to my sermon online for other people to, and then I start to prepare sermons thinking about how some, theologian on Twitter who follows me, I'm like, how would they listen to this sermon? And then I'm not thinking about the people so I don't link to my own sermons. But even on Sunday, like me and my wife were talking about the sermon afterwards, and she's like, oh yeah, I'm going to send a link of it to our friend so-and-so because they'll really benefit from it. And it's just, and I'm like, oh yeah, like good thing our church has a video content that's easy to share, right? Like it's all the back and forth of these decisions. And I think having the conversation is important. So you have these books you talk about, even in the analog church, it's a front door, it's a lobby area, but the focus of your church life is like the focus of your home's life. The front door, the front porch is not the most important thing. The kitchen, the living room, so you're helping in your books people not like just assess technology, but live out the Christian life in light of technology. Why did you feel the need to write this latest book, Listen, Speak? What was it that you said, I've said these things about the church, about the Christian life. I need to say more.
Yeah, I mean, it really primarily it was just my own personal struggle. It's a more personal book in some ways than the first two. Analog Christian's fairly personal as well, but I just, in the noise and cacophony of our day, like in the chaotic frenzy of social media and news media, and honestly just like the voices in my own head, and I was finding it increasingly difficult to hear the voice of God. And, I grew up in the church. I spent a few years sort of as an agnostic, deconstructing faith before I came back to Jesus in my early 20s. And so I've spent the majority of my life, at least in the church, and about half my life, as a devoted, committed follower of Jesus. But I've always struggled with that concept. Like, God is speaking, listen to God, hear God's voice. Like, I've never heard God's voice audibly in my life. I've had some experiences where it felt very close to audible, but even those experiences have been so few and far between. So I was growing increasingly frustrated just with my own lack of clarity on God's voice. And then I think a lot of people will be able to relate to this, especially in recent years, the last half decade or so. It's become increasingly difficult to feel heard in any meaningful way. It just feels like everyone's screaming and shouting at each other. Is it even worth saying anything? Is it even worth speaking? And yet, followers of Jesus are good news people. And, that word gospel, euangelion, it's proclamation. It was before the Christians co-opted the word. It was a Roman propaganda word. It was a political word. It was like the gospel of Caesar. And the gospel is meant to be proclaimed, heralded. Like literally the word means like to proclaim the good news kind of thing. It means good news, but the way it was used in the Roman Empire, the gospel was always like a proclamation from a herald. And as a Christian, I just felt like, is it even worth speaking the gospel. Like no one's really listening. It's just noise, I'm just adding to the chaos. And
Hmm.
I felt like there had to be a way through that, to hear God's voice with clarity amid all of the cacophony, and to speak into the chaos in a way where good news can really be heard. So I just went on a journey, and thought I would share it with the world.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, for me to hear kind of your perspective in the valley, I think for people who don't live there, you almost imagine that like, okay, it's like this super forward-leaning, futuristic place, and to many extents, it is. Every time I go there, there's like all of this cool, exciting stuff happening, all of this tech news. It's like there is this like um, you know collaboration that's happening because there's a high density of people working in tech, but at the
Yeah.
same time you will also see this like pullback from that. So like with the autonomous vehicles that are running there with Waymo, you'll have people in the streets who are like kicking them and taking them down and attacking them
Yeah.
because they're resisting this future. So there's this interesting paradigm where it's like, no, not everyone is like super forward leaning. It's actually like people are reacting to that. So in your book, you say there's a difference between praying towards a future and fixating on the future. And I
Yeah.
think, fixation, you say, is a form of control, and prayer is a form of surrender. For people who are working in tech, especially with AI and all these things that are like at the cusp, banging on our minds every day, what encouragement or wisdom would you say to people in that space on like fixation and prayer, and even just like the impetus to do something and
Yeah.
contribute?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joel. I think prayer is misunderstood. I long misunderstood prayer. I really thought of it as um, sort of like a vending machine mechanism. If I get on my knees and press A, and then if I put my hands together and press 6, then God uncoils the little metal ring and I get my bag of Funyuns or whatever. And I think most people listening know how ridiculous that is intellectually. But experientially, viscerally in our real lives, I think still for most of us, still for me even, the temptation is to think of prayer that way, or not think of prayer that way, but like approach prayer that way. And the reason I think that is because the times when I pray the most, like for example, I have prayed so much this week, but it's not because I've been motivated by this deep desire to surrender my life and the sort of direction of my life to God. It's not because of deep desire necessarily to just live in union and communion with God. I've prayed a ton this week because um, I'm preaching on a really difficult subject this coming Sunday, and I'm like, oh Lord, please. And then I've got a list of, they're not demands, but like, oh God, please, I need you to, and then fill in the blank with a number of things. And it's driven by, all sorts of fleshly things like anxiety and fear and shame and guilt and all those sorts of things. But my encouragement would be, man, what would it look like if we did the hard work of slowly over time, um, moving prayer to a different part of, like, a different category in our hearts and minds? That prayer is not some form of having God fulfill the fixation. That's typically what we want from God. But instead, what if we saw prayer as a meaningful way to surrender all fixations, so that in that space now, God fills it with a deep desire for Him? You know, um, I just it's hard to wrap our minds around, and it's even harder to actually embody. But I've discovered that a change in appetite and desire is the key. And I think prayer is the path to that. Instead of using prayer as a mechanism to satisfy our current desires and appetites, when we can see prayer as a means of surrendering those desires and appetites and inviting God by His Spirit to reorient those desires and those appetites, that's when we live the most satisfied, fulfilled prayer life. And I'm realizing that and learning that experientially, very slowly.
Hmm. No, it's interesting to really reflect on that desire and appetite. I recently heard someone talk about, like, your kids always do what they want to do. They say, "Oh, they can't sleep in. I just can't do it." Or I can't wake up. I need to sleep in. I just can't get out of bed. I just can't get out of bed. But if there's a hockey game at 8 a.m., then they're getting out of bed for that hockey game. If
Yeah.
there's concert tickets for Taylor Swift and they have to stay
Yeah.
awake until midnight, then they stay awake until midnight. They have no issue
Yeah,
disciplining
as they
themselves,
should.
because the discipline often matches the desire, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So we need to form our desires, reorient them. Prayer is a good way of that. One of the things that I've been reflecting on is, you talk about it in the book, that just the distracted age, the cacophony, the noise. And we even, like, I go through my day often with headphones in. And I find myself, like, and I won't be the first person to reflect on this. Silence is difficult. Silence hurts in a way. If there's a prolonged period of time where I'm not doing something, to Joel's point, or hearing something in my head of beautiful music, it can be enchanting in the way that you described, with as a child experiencing technology. But I would almost say that the modern headphones, which is only 150 years old as a technology, it basically is the physical reality of Charles Taylor's thesis of disenchantment. Like, we literally become isolated from the world, from each other, and we do not listen to others because we don't even have an opportunity to hear them, because we are so often blocked by the physical sounds that we put in our own ear. Like, going through the grocery store the other day, I was like convicted, because I'm thinking about this and I'm like, why do I have headphones in instead of getting to know my neighbors? And I don't know, I'm just kind of reflecting on this in our desires, and how do we, like, get out of that? Like, for myself, I'm trying to work through this, and I still find myself in the grocery store saying, "Oh, but if I could just, I'm halfway through that book, that audiobook, or there's that theology podcast. I'll sound smarter on our next episode if I just get through this book." But I'm not present because of the noise that I even choose to give myself. So how do we navigate out of that noise?
Gosh, that is a beautiful and profound question. I think I would agree with you on a personal level. I can totally relate to what you're saying, all of it, really, Andrew. That I have become, my body has become wired or rewired to crave noise. Silence is deafening, and again, it comes down to the long and slow, and it is always long and slow process of a reorientation of the heart. There's that famous quote by Thomas Cranmer where he says, "What the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies." And we typically live in the ease and comfort of the justified mind. So that little ping you had in your spirit walking through the grocery store, I think, is your heart, like the imago Dei in your soul, peeking its head above the fray and saying, "Hey, Andrew, like, there might be a different way to live your life," But the reason it's so easy to just, it's not just habit. It is habit, but the reason the habit is there and we don't feel the sort of like that ping in our guts is because we've gone through that process where we've given into, like, when the scriptures say the heart is deceitful, when the writer of Proverbs says, like, above all else, guard your heart because everything you do flows out of it. That's like, all of that is about desire and longing, and guarding your heart is not just, I grew up hearing that verse applied to dating all the time. It's like, girls, guard your hearts. I never knew what that meant. I was like, what does that mean? Like, how do you guard? But I think it's much more expansive than that. It's about paying close attention and living with keen awareness to our desires and our longings, and asking the question, man, do those desires and longings set me on a course toward life and life to the full, the life God has for me, for his glory and for, my good and the flourishing of all. So I think that's where it begins. Typically for me, my temptation is to say, let me just change the habit. So I'll just put my AirPods away when I go to the grocery store. And I think that's a good thing to do. But there's a very high chance, like a high likelihood that won't last, because eventually what my heart loves, my will choose, and then my mind will just justify it in whatever way. You know what I mean? And it's exactly what you said. It's like, oh, well, this is for the Lord. Because if I keep listening to this book, I'll get smarter, and then it'll just be more of a blessing to more people. It's like and that's not all bad. Like, that's not all bad for people
but
who
it's
do
the
what we
self-justifying.
do.
Like, you're pegging me right now, Jay. Like,
I'm pegging myself. I'm with you. So yeah, I think it's, again, coming back to prayer, I think it's like the effortful participation in the act of surrendering misguided and distorted desires, and being brutally honest with ourselves. Why do I feel that pressure to constantly have content shoved down my ear? Well, if I connect enough of the dots, for me, a lot of it is like, yeah, somewhere along the path, some of those dots are truly because I want to be well versed in particular things so that, I can be a blessing to others through my teaching or whatever. But if I keep connecting those dots, there's all sorts of other things that are not godly. Like, it has to do with my own insecurity and, like family of origin stuff and wanting to impress people. So I think just being brutally honest about those things and then surrendering those desires to God is probably the starting point.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for what you're saying is really sitting with me well. There was a famous AI researcher, Andre Carpathy, on Twitter or X. He recently posted that he came back from a 2-week detox. And I think a lot of people who don't have the tools in the Christian faith of like even knowing like how prayer also allows you to have that mindfulness and create that separation from the world, they only have these options of like, okay, I'm just going to do detox, but I don't really have the tool set to understand what I'm doing there is realigning these patterns and desires that I'm so inundated with. And for us as Christians, we're so privileged, to have a connection to God to provide that. And I think, for me, it's just like, it's encouraging to be like, wow, we have that. We really should be tapping into that blessing.
Yeah. I think detox is like really powerful imagery for it, because when a person detoxes from anything, like from alcohol, there's loss and gain. There's a leaving and a returning. You are losing the sort of temporary satisfaction that comes from drinking a lot of alcohol, being inebriated, or being, like detached from all your problems or whatever. But what you gain is life. You like literally gain your life back. You're not killing yourself anymore. And what you're leaving is the path to death, and what you're returning to is the path to life on a physiological level when you detox from alcohol or drugs or whatever. And I think it's like, it sounds really dramatic to say, but I think it's the same thing, especially for the Christian. If we can carve out space in our lives to stop shoving commentary down our own throats and our own heads and earbuds, and instead create space, like leave that to create the space to listen for the voice of God, we're returning to life, the source of life. And so I love that imagery.
Yeah. Even my friends who aren't on social media, like, I feel like this book is applicable. Like, I picked up this book thinking, okay, it's going to be about listening, prayer. Maybe it'll be a social media oriented book, but it's more of a discipleship book. Like, it's a book to form in the way that we're describing around surrender to God. And there's different pieces. You're a word guy. What does cacophony mean? It's a fancy word, but it means like noisy clashing cymbals, right?
Yeah, essentially chaos. I mean, they're synonyms, but I just like the C sound.
It kind of hits you. It's funny when the word itself makes the sound of cacophony. Like, it's just annoying.
Alliteration. Yeah.
Yeah,
whatever
it
it's
does.
called.
It does. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we live in a cacophonic world. I don't know how to use it in that sense, but we live in a world of chaos, of
Yeah.
noise,
Yeah.
and even my friends who aren't on social media, Christian friends, when we talk, there's always something coming up about how difficult it is, whatever that difficulty is, in our modern age. So with parenting kids in a public school, and did you hear about what the latest school
Mm.
board decision was?
Yeah.
And this book is in our kids library, it hasn't been sent home, we think the teacher's okay, but it's just wild what's going on. Or people in the workplace, and they're being required to do pronouns, and they're like, with my conscience, like, I just cannot, I feel like I'm endorsing an ideology or whatever, like,
Mm.
or there's all sorts of issues, like, we don't need to go into each of the political issues. But one of the things that I was like struck by reading your book, you talk about distress, and Paul felt distressed in Acts
Yeah.
17.
Yeah.
And then you go from that, and it's like Paul is distressed at the idols around him. And then he reasons. So you
Yeah.
go from an emotional response to what's going on in our world. But if we
Yeah.
want to imitate Jesus, and Paul says, if you want to imitate Jesus, look at my life. So,
Yeah.
imitate Paul's example here, reason with people.
Yeah.
That was wild to me. And like, I've read Act 17 a million times. I've gone to, conferences where it's unpacked, and that will stick with me forever. I think of distress to reason. How do we do that? Unpack that concept for us a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's not, I didn't come up with that. It's literally in the story, It's
Right.
like, those are the words, and they're good translations. Like they essentially in the original Greek mean what we sort of think the words distress and reason mean. And you're right. When you look at them juxtaposed sort of next to each other, you're like, especially in our cultural moment, in the noisy world we live in like, there's zero reason on Facebook feeds, and it's just all distress, being like screamed at from everyone's anxious, everyone's nervous or whatever. And yeah, I mean, obviously the Acts story is not some sort of prescriptive step-by-step process. The writer is not trying to tell us like, so here's how you do it, the 7 steps. But from Paul's story, I think we can infer a couple of things. He must have told somebody, right? Like he must have told Luke, or somebody who told Luke, this is how he felt, because it's a really strong word.
Right.
So the reality is he told the right people, because the people he was trying to speak to, like share good news to, he doesn't speak in distress. The word is like he reasons with them. And some of that is because of the cultural setting. Like he's at the Areopagus. But what's really interesting is, that's where we get the word Mars Hill from. The Areopagus was like it was a council. Like it wasn't just like kind of casual, leisurely, I don't know, man, what do you think? Over a glass of wine. It was an actual council that had put Paul on trial, at least a form of a trial. So the setting actually is a distressing sort of environment. Like Paul is essentially being accused and judged, and yet he chooses to reason, which I think has a lot to do with, if you read Paul's letters, it has a lot to do with the fact that he stands on steady ground. Like his body even is not reacting to the environment. This is why he's able to write things like, honestly, you guys, like in Philippians, when he says, for me, to live is Christ, to die is gain. And if you read that section of Philippians, he basically says, I'm paraphrasing him here, but if you read it, he says, honestly, it'd be better for me if I died. Like, that'd be awesome, because then I would just go be with Jesus. Like, I can't wait. But it's better for you if I stay. So I'm going to stay. And for him, what that meant was like going on living this earthly life was a weird act of sacrifice. Because he was so near Jesus, he lived in such communion with the resurrected Christ. What he wanted was to be literally with Jesus, And if you think about someone who lives with that perspective, nothing is distressing. Like somebody wrote on your Facebook post that your candidate of choice is an idiot. And what happens on Facebook is just like distress, anxiety, anger. We get biblical with each other. Here's why my candidate is like the most Christian choice, whatever. And it's so distressing. We're like, we're not reasoning. We're not calm. We're not, exuding the fruit of the Spirit. We're certainly not gentle or kind or good to each other. And it's because we stand on really shaky ground. We've kind of believed this false narrative that if I'm wrong about this candidate of choice, we're screwed. But the reality is the path to, the path to human flourishing does not run through Washington, D.C. or the White House. It runs through Calvary and the cross. And Paul knew that. Like, he knew that whether the Roman Empire rose or fell didn't really matter, because the victory was already won and Jesus is risen. And why stress? You know what I mean? Like, why distress? The times when Paul is distressed in his letters, the only times, and he's distressed quite a bit, it's not because of what's happening circumstantially in the world or in culture, as it is for most of us today. The only times Paul is distressed is when the people of God are living in such a way that they've forgotten that what's happening in this world doesn't have the power they think it has over them. Like, that's when he gets distressed. He's basically like, dude, guys, seriously.
Why don't you get it?
They're living. Yeah, like, don't you understand? Like, victory's
I'm gonna send Timothy
won.
to you. You guys got to settle down. Like,
yeah. So, anyways, I've also found just profound comfort and confidence in that story of Paul at the Areopagus.
Yeah, no, I appreciate how you're kind of encouraging Christians. I mean, it's in the title of the book with listen, listen, speak, but there's been some kind of approaches to, you need to help them belong before you teach them to believe, like a really, really delayed evangelism approach, or kind of a just a let's be so cautious on any hot topic that we're not going to preach on sexuality. We're gonna do that for a Sunday night evening thing where there's far less people or whatever. We're gonna stay away from hot button topics. But you don't want us to shut up. You want us to listen and to speak. So that part for me was helpful. There's a whole debate that came out of a James Wood article that I thought was actually very well written, but then it turned into a whole social media storm about how Tim Keller, his third way or his disposition towards things. And we're not going to get into that whole debate now, but how do you approach kind of being a pastor and speaking on issues publicly? I follow you on socials. You're not super active posting about all these hot button issues, but you're in the middle of a sexuality sermon series. Like, you're not shying away from that. How should a Christian, like, I think about, some people I know in the workplace, and they're trying to figure out, do I speak up and defend my Christian convictions, or do I just, go with the flow? And it's sometimes you just have to speak up. How should we do that? How should we speak well?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's so much to say about it. I think I hope the most helpful sort of primer I can give it in this conversation is, and I'll just touch on what you said, that you're right on social media. One, I'm not like super active on social media in general, but when I do post things, it's very rare that I will enter the fray. But you also, told people, because it's true, we're in the middle of, and I live in a very progressive liberal part of the country. Silicon Valley is hyper progressive liberal. It's a very, anyways, especially on things like sexuality and gender. I personally, in our church, hold what we would consider a historic Orthodox sexual ethic, Christian sexual ethic. For example, sexual intimacy reserved for one man, one woman in the covenant of marriage. That is not the majority belief in Silicon Valley. So by far, it is by far the minority belief. But we have a fairly large church, I think, for Silicon Valley especially, and we're doing 5 weeks on sexuality and gender and a Christian
Yeah.
ethic, biblical vision for sexuality. It's like not the most popular thing to say here. So the only reason I share that, not to pat our church on the back, is to name that dichotomy because it gets to my response to your question.
Hmm.
I don't really post about sexuality much on social media, but it's not because I have nothing to say. I have 5 weeks worth of things to say in great detail, actually. Uh, and I am saying them. It's also not because I'm scared to say them. I'm saying them. And I'm saying them not to like three people in a small room with a small group. I'm saying them to thousands of people every Sunday.
Yeah, you're not going to take down the live stream on those weeks.
No, anybody. Yeah, if anyone wants to, they can go on and watch it and post it and whatever. They could do that. But the reason I operate that way is because this gets to your question. Neil Postman, his work has been most helpful for me here. I think that, and Postman was writing in the mid to late 80s, and he was commenting on the era of television. But if you read Amusing Ourselves to Death, which I would recommend for everybody,
Yeah.
and you didn't know he wrote in the 80s, you would think he wrote this book yesterday. Like, it's so wild the way he talks about it. It just sounds like he's describing the internet and social media. And he's got this beautiful thing, really like sobering thing he does with the how transportation technology changed information, and I think you guys are familiar with this. He talks about how before the telegraph, information was primarily local. So because before the telegraph, the speed of information was the speed of train. That was the fastest that news could go from one place to another. And at that time, trains went about 35 miles an hour. News was primarily local because if you lived hundreds of miles away, by the time that news got to you on a train, there's a good chance it wasn't really news anymore because it took so long to get to you. So primarily news was like in your neighborhood, in your town, in your city. Hey, Farmer John's farm burnt down last night. That was in the newspaper. So Farmer John because he lives 2 blocks down the street. So now it's not like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's happened. That happened in Baltimore or whatever. It's like, oh, I better take some food to Farmer John and his family because I know Farmer John and I can get it to them, And today, man, all of us listening know like that is not the news. This is self-indictment. Like I find myself addicted to just opening up Twitter or X or whatever and scrolling. And some of it is good. Like I'm really grateful that I'm informed on what is happening in, Gaza or Ukraine or whatever. Like I'm glad from a prayer perspective and otherwise. But sometimes we get so wrapped up in that at the detriment of living keenly aware in the proximal spaces where we can actually have an impact. So that's why I try to deep dive into the hard stuff locally. Because when I talk about sexuality, I'm talking about it with men and women that I know and love, like men and women that will sit in this office that we can just have ongoing conversation with. If I blast my opinion in 240 characters, like I'm basically blasting that to people that I'll never see, have no relationship with except digitally mediated ones. So that's what I would say. Think about speaking your voice will be heard through relational and geographic proximity in a way that it'll never be heard digitally. That would be my encouragement. So focus the energy of your speaking within proximity over the long haul instead of these sporadic few times a day I log on and just spew whatever. Think about it proximally is what I would say.
Yeah. I think for me, I agree with like listening to God and being intentional about where you speak. And then at the same time, I'm always like, oh, but are we risking, like, for example, in the topic of technology, which is like an area that as Christians we should speak and contribute. Are we risking having the thought that like, well, this is not exactly like my main focus, so I'm going to step away from that conversation. I'm going to like step off of the 200 character platform because I'm focused on the effect locally. And then it kind of almost leaves a vacuum in those other environments too, where Christian thought or Christian contribution is missing.
Yeah.
So I always wrestle with that personally, especially as someone like in tech. So it's like, how do you know the wisdom of when you should be leaning into those conversations?
Yeah, agreed. I'm with you 100%. You know, Andrew, you were mentioning the debate I was on for the Gospel Coalition earlier. I was on that debate with Patrick Miller, who's a dear, dear friend. Actually, Brett McCracken at the Gospel Coalition, who mediated that debate, he was like, he had to coach us ahead of time. You have to actually debate, because we had spent the whole day like having drinks and just hanging out. You know, he's a dear friend. But he has an organization that tries to do exactly that. It's like, man, the running question for them is, what if all the Christians left the internet? What would happen to the internet? And that's a frightening proposition. So I'm with you, Joel. But again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. What's been helpful for me is digital informs, analog transforms. So when I speak into the digital ether, if I can do it in such a way that I want to just inform, like my goal is to simply inform you, or to correct misinformation, or like to color incomplete information, then I'm going to do that. But often I think digital online discourse on social media, especially, becomes this distressed pursuit of transforming the other person.
Right.
And that is futile. Like it is futile. To inform them is a beautiful thing. It's like, oh, you said these things. Hey, listen, from my perspective, like I would just add this to the conversation. Or like, that's actually not true. Like, let me inform you with X, Y, and Z. And then just entrust that transformation is going to happen or not happen for them. But whether it happens or not, either way, it'll be an analog embodied experiences where they live with the people that know them and they know. And again, connecting the dots, for me personally, that's been so helpful in alleviating much of the distress when I do engage online. I just, you know what? I'm not frustrated that I have not convinced you to my side. I don't expect that to happen here. I'm just informing you.
Right.
And then I just let it go, because my focus is on the transformation journey of, you know, me, my own life, and then those within my actual proximity.
Yeah, that's been good. Really good hearing from you. And, you know, this is just a snippet of what you have in your book. So really excited for other people to have the opportunity to hear.
I want to ask a question about elevators just before. It's like the last question, because I want to get into that. Brief comment, though, because it kind of connects with, like, I find myself posting on social media sometimes not to transform others or inform others, but to create kind of my desired perceived identity, and to have, going to the heart level, like inner desires, like I want to be liked and loved. And then it gets to like, oh, if like a few more people follow me or a few more people retweet me, like, oh, I am making a difference in the world. I do have a sense of security. I am living purposefully. Like there's this weird, like, if we're just honest, and there have been studies on this that have like talked, like the people who really post a lot online, some of them, and sometimes people would argue most of them, have these real insecurities, and that's what they're trying to position themselves publicly. And I just confess that that's something that I can struggle with too. And we just always need to reflect.
Agreed.
On that positioning side. But elevators. So last question about elevators. Do you think Jesus would find elevator rides awkward? So you give a story of elevator rides in your book. And so do you think Jesus would find elevator rides to be awkward? Because many people do find them to be awkward.
Yeah. I don't think he would. I mean, just read the gospel accounts. He seems utterly comfortable in awkward spaces and awkward situations. I think I would venture to guess that he would have loved them. Maybe he would have hung out in elevators. I don't know. Never getting off on any floor, just hanging out there. Hey, what's up? You know, strike up a conversation. One little quick miracle. I don't know. I think he would have loved them, honestly.
Cool. Cool. Well, just for context, in the book, there's these levels of proximity that most people have. And so most of us, when someone's within 3 or 4 feet of us, it feels like they're in our personal space. But yeah, Jesus once had someone touch his garments and that sort of thing. It's a natural part of intimacy, and love is sometimes being close to each other. And that medium is a better medium for messages to be shared, perhaps.
Are you going to tell people to strike up an elevator conversation the next chance they get? Is that an advice you can give?
Yeah, maybe. Go hang out in an elevator all day and have awkward conversations with people unsuspected. It's funny. Right. There's been a recent debate online. Not that I follow Twitter too much. I'm actually trying to take a Twitter break right now. So this is before I started my Twitter break, of whether or not you should talk to the person next to you on an air flight or whatever. And apparently like 20-30% of people would absolutely not want to talk to the person next to them, but most people are open to conversation, according to some survey. And some people were dunking on this, saying absolutely not. Airplanes are for reading books and not talking to others. And anyways, it's just an interesting thought. Well, thanks, Jay. We've like barely scratched the surface on your book, so people can get it as of today. It's literally the first day as of Tuesday in April, whenever the Tuesday is, 5 days from now or whatever. It is the first day of Speak, Listen. There's, I think, some intentionality with the title. Listen, Speak. So thanks, Jay, for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's been awesome.
Thank you, listeners. You can check out other episodes at whatwouldjesustech.com. You can support this show there. Thank you to our Patreons who support us. And everyone, use tech, find rest, and glorify God. Take care.
See ya.